Now in public, and we are resuming the discussion on the COVAX motion. And when we last left off on this motion, we had captured, and I think there was agreement within the committee to preserve the speaking order, which at the time was Ms. McPherson and then followed by Mr. Oliphant. And if anyone else would like to be placed on that list, please do so by raising your hand virtually as the usual custom. Ms. McPherson, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chair, I believe that there has been some discussions, and I would like to just very quickly ask if we have some ability to go forward with this, if this is something we can do instead of continuing to waste time, if we could just make an agreement. I think if Mr. Oliphant has anything you'd like to bring forward, I see his hand is up.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. McPherson. Mr. Oliphant, please.
Yeah, so I think it's not exactly the best procedure, but I think it'll work for us informally if we can. I've talked to a few of you, and we think that Mr. Bergeron came up with a good sub-amendment to the amendment that I had made to the motion that was made by Mr. Harris on, with Ms. McPherson. And if what we would like, we would propose that we move fairly quickly to voting on the sub-amendment made by Mr. Bergeron, which would then nullify the amendment that I had made. And then I think we would have a motion as amended by the sub-amendment that we may all be able to live with, and would be happy to proceed that way. Not that we're tired of talking about the motion, but we're tired of talking about the motion. So I think this would, Mr. Bergeron presented a very good solution, and it's had 2 weeks to germinate, and I think that would be a great way forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oliphant. Monsieur Bergeron, est-ce que vous aimeriez...
Mr. Bergeron, did you want to read your sub-amendment? Yes, Mr. Chairman. So, as amended, that the committee recognizes that due to a variety of factors, the government has faced delays in the supply of vaccines for Canadians through national manufacturing and international procurement. Canada is the only G7 country accessing vaccines through COVAX, an initiative intended to provide vaccines to high-risk individuals in low and middle-income countries. These supply difficulties accentuate the vulnerabilities of Canadians to dangerous variants and extends the detrimental global economic impacts of COVID-19 by delaying vaccinations to high-risk people in poor countries. Finally, that the Minister of International Development be invited to discuss this issue with the members of the committee. Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron. Any further debate on this sub-amendment?
On the sub-amendment. Ms. McPherson.
At the very, very terrifying risk of extending this further, I just wonder whether or not it would be possible to have something at the end that just said us to invite the minister as soon as possible, or whether that can be just direction, not within the motion, but direction that we could give to the clerk.
I think the latter could most certainly be accommodated, Madam Clerk, as we can just have an implicit direction to you that this be done as soon as possible, and I'm getting a nod from our clerk.
I don't need to make an amendment because goodness knows how long that would take.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. McPherson. Any other points? Ms. Sahota.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I'm happy with the amendment. It's pretty much in line with what I was proposing earlier on too, with the invitation of the minister, and verbally, of course, I was speaking to that being an option. I think on the fly, I just wasn't able to quickly revise, but absolutely, it's exactly what I envisioned as well. So I want to thank Mr. Bergeron for coming to this agreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sahota. Any other comments, any other debate on the sub-amendment? Seeing none, is the committee prepared to adopt the sub-amendment by unanimous consent? Any opposition? Okay. Seeing none, Madam Clerk, we've adopted the sub-amendment proposed by Monsieur Bergeron. And that takes us back to the original amendment by Mr. Oliphant, which textually has been nullified, but we still need to vote on it procedurally. Is that correct, Madam Clerk? Okay, so we will now take the vote on the amendment of the motion. Any discussion? I'm sorry, not the vote. Any discussion on the amendment of the motion? Mr. Oliphant.
I think I would check with the clerk about this, but I think it is now irrelevant. The amendment is now irrelevant. Does it really have to be voted on?
Procedurally, I believe it does, but let me just double check. Madam Clerk?
Yes, Mr. Chair. However, if there's unanimous consent, then that's fine. We could just say it amends the whole motion.
I would ask for unanimous consent then, Mr. Chair, through you, just to move to the motion, not emotion.
Okay, I had Monsieur Bergeron had his hand raised. Est-ce que vous avez du commentaire, Monsieur Bergeron?
Any comments, Mr. Bergeron? Actually, I fully agree. I think the sub-amendment dealt with the amendment, so there's no point in discussing the actual amendment. Okay, thank you very much.
And adopt the motion as amended by unanimous consent. Any opposition? And seeing none, Madam Clerk, the committee has adopted the motion as amended. And thank you very much for the discussion, the fulsome discussion, your indulgence. And we have achieved the resolution of this motion. That leaves us a good amount of time. And I had asked Dr. Fry if she would be prepared to move her motion, which has been put on notice. And I think the discussion time that we have left should be sufficient, but I don't want to prejudge that. Dr. Fry, would you want to formally move your motion?
Thank you, Chair. I would. I am hoping it's not a contentious motion, but you never know, obviously, because everyone's entitled to an opinion. But the motion reads that the Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development devote 3 meetings to a study on the nature of and solutions to the increasing violence and human rights abuses by right-wing extremists against women, LGBTQ2, ethnic minorities, female journalists and parliamentarians, inflicted and condoned by certain nation states through legislation, policies, and incarcerations. The piece about right-wing extremists, I added because if you recall, Mr. Fonseca had a motion that he wanted to bring forward on that issue alone, and we kind of combined it to find one that was acceptable to both of us. The point that I'm trying to make is this, that we know that there are right-wing extremist groups, you know, Proud Boys and La 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 and neo-Nazis and Ku Klux Klans and all these kinds of people floating around. We accept this from non-governmental organizations and from non-state actors. What is becoming increasingly evident is that state actors, governments are now condoning this kind of extremist activity. And are doing so by bringing forward legislation, actually abusing human rights. And I can give you examples. One of them is what's going on in Belarus right now. And it's mostly women who are taking to the streets in Belarus, and they are being picked up by police and thrown into jail. We see it happening in Hungary and to a great extent in Poland. We see that the ability for people to even have that democratic right to protest peacefully is being actually denied, not just by people who are scaring them, who are NGOs or non-state actors, but when the state puts a heavy hand on this. And this is becoming increasingly so in a lot of countries. In Latin America, for starters, in the OSCE, this is beginning to become a trend. And I really think that we need to do 2 things, because that was what I asked. I asked that we look at the nature of what forms are these kinds of abuses taking? What forms are these denial of human rights taking? What forms are these restrictions on democratic principles taking? And what are the solutions? Because I hate us just sort of wandering around, deciding how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. I like us to come up with some sort of solution at the end of the day. And I think that given the last motion that we just agreed to, I think it's shown that if people have the ability to discuss something long enough, to get answers, that we actually can come together and find an agreement. And I want to thank Mr. Bergeron for making that happen in the COVAX motion. I mean, we talked, a lot of people think we wasted time, but it wasn't. It's by, as Winston Churchill said, it's better to jaw than to war. By talking to each other, we begin to understand, and we begin to find that we can come to some kinds of consensus when we do things. And so I'm hoping that one of the things that we can do is to talk about not only what is going on, what are the forms that it's taking, whether legislative or in other ways, and what are the solutions? Because this is increasing. COVID has put a strong light and shed a light on what is going on, and it's happening greatly around the world. I mean, I can just throw names out there, Venezuela, Brazil, Belarus, as I said before, and other countries in the OSCE region that are actually not only denying democracy, but actually nation states are now making these things formal by bringing in, we saw it to the south of us, by actually bringing in legislation and policies to try and move that agenda forward. For me, it's the thin edge of the wedge. It's a slippery slope. When we know that we can point a finger at NGOs that are running around doing things, and we can say, oh, but that's not legal, you can't do that, and you can't do this. But when nation states decide to make it formal by legislating it in many ways, I think we need to start looking at this. We remember what happened in the Second World War, how it all began. We remember that it was that nation states that agreed, created a great deal of man's inhumanity to man and genocide and many other things. We're seeing this happening against minorities. And I know specifically in Europe, it's happening against the Roma, it's happening against the Sinti, it's happening against women. We see some of these nation states denying fundamental rights to LGBTQ2 persons, to racial groups. It is happening. Minorities are under attack right now, and it's being sanctioned by certain states. And I would really like us to pay attention to this, to find out what's happening, why it's happening, because I do believe that this could lead, as more and more nations believe that they can get away with it, that we will actually begin to see the movement towards what happened in the Second World War, rising fascism globally, by certain nation states, which we never expected to, who embraced democratic principles and are now walking away from it. I think this is something that we need to think about as a preemptive thing, as a whole issue of security and peace, and really discuss it, because I think it's at the edge of the wedge. Thank you, Chair.
Dr. Fry, thank you very much. I have a list that currently includes Mr. Chong, Mr. Fonseca, and Mr. Diot. Colleagues, if you wish to intervene, please use the raise hand feature as usual. Mr. Genuis also raised his hand just now. We will start with Mr. Chong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's one part of the motion that I think should be amended, and I move that we amend. I move an amendment to the motion that we remove the two words right wing, so that it would simply read abuses by extremists and so on and so forth. And the reason why I'm proposing that amendment is twofold. First, extremism can come from both the extreme right and the extreme left. In fact, Dr. Fry mentioned, enumerated a number of countries where we are seeing attacks against women, LGBTQ2 plus individuals, ethnic minorities and the like. And she enumerated countries like Belarus, but also Venezuela. And Venezuela is an example of an extreme left government in place. In fact, it's a socialist party in Venezuela that is in power. But more importantly, I think basing our, more importantly, I think we should follow the advice of CSIS that is actually eschewed using the term extreme right-wing, has eschewed the term right-wing extremism and left-wing extremism. In fact, I'll quote from the 2019 CSIS public report of the Government of Canada. In the report, they have a paragraph titled Ideologically Motivated Violent Extremism, IMVE. Ideologically motivated violent extremism is often driven by a range of grievances and ideas from across the traditional ideological spectrum. The resulting worldview consists of a personalized narrative which centers on an extremist's willingness to incite, enable, or mobilize to violence. Extremists draw inspiration from a variety of sources, including books, images, lectures, music, online discussions, videos, and conversations. Given the diverse combination of motivations and personalized worldviews of recent mass casualty attackers, the use of such terms as, quote, right-wing, end quote, and, quote, left-wing, end quote, is not only subjective, but inaccurate in describing the complexity of motivations of IMVE attacks in Canada and abroad. And so I just bring that to the committee's attention as a constructive suggestion. And in subsequent reports of the Government of Canada, they've actually not used the terms right-wing extremism or left-wing extremism because clearly the government has concluded that it is a subjective and inaccurate way of classifying these hate-filled ideologies. So I move that amendment for that reason. Thank you.
Mr. Chung, thank you very much. Colleagues, there's an amendment on the floor. I have a list of speakers. If any of you have raised your hands to speak to the original motion and your comments are not directly on the amendment at the moment, I would ask you to lower your hand. If everybody's prepared to speak on the amendment as introduced by Mr. Chung, the sequence right now is Mr. Fonseca, Mr. Diot, Mr. Genuis, Mr. Bergeron, and Dr. Fry. We will start with Mr. Fonseca.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to MP Chung. And Dr. Fry, thank you, and I concur with everything that you said. I couldn't agree more. Having a terminology right-wing extremist groups that are out there, or these right-wing groups, is what we hear every day. It's on the news every night. And we hear about, the Proud Boys, and we saw what happened south of the border. We see what's happening in many countries in Europe, and we see how it's being supported through policy and through different governments. So I would keep that terminology in. I believe that it gets used every single night by our media outlets. So why wouldn't that be the terminology that we would use? That these are right-wing extreme, right-wing paramilitary type groups. We saw what happened in the U.S. and we see what's happening around the world. So I would keep it.
Okay, Mr. Fonseca, thank you very much. Mr. Diot.
Yes. Well, I agree with my colleague, Mr. Chong. Basically, the motion. I mean, I love the fact that we could be looking at exposing a lot of human rights abuses and so forth, and we know the world is full of them. In some ways, it's way too broad. I don't know where you'd even start, because I think that there are probably human rights violations in almost every nation in the world if you started drilling down. But it is far broad. It's far too broad, and it's very subjective when you talk about right-wing extremists. I'll give you an example. I was just looking at the Toronto Star today, and this columnist opined the following. In truth, the vast majority of mainstream media leans to the right. That includes the Globe and Mail, National Post, and other post-media newspapers, the Toronto Sun, other Sun newspapers across Canada, CTV, Global TV, and a slew of talk radio shows. So in this person's opinion, all mainstream media appears to be right-wing. I think you get a pretty good argument from most conservatives that that is not true. So I agree with Mr. Chong that we should take out the right-wing reference and talk about ideologically motivated, perhaps, and then make it as broad a study as possible. Thanks.
All right, Mr. Diot, thank you very much. Mr. Genuis.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll have some things to say, I guess, on the main motion when we get back to it, because procedurally, this is a recommendation for a study. And generally speaking, these are conversations that happen at the Subcommittee on Agenda and Procedure, which is sort of an effort to work out specific parameters around what kinds of studies we want to do, prioritize different agenda items. I think obviously there's a lot of value to the things that could be studied in terms of the issues that Dr. Fry referred to. There's a very broad spectrum of issues that she referred to, and I do think the call for some degree of focus is important. And just to speak to the amendment in particular, I would say this. I mean, I think we see an authoritarian trend around the world, and I guess my own view is a great deal of that is enabled by the more aggressive posture of the Chinese government in the world that is trying to push authoritarian norms that are contrary to democratic norms, and that sort of authoritarian trend puts on quote unquote right-wing clothing, puts on left-wing clothing.
Mr. Jenners, I'm sorry, I'm getting a flag here from the tech department. Is it possible? Yes, exactly what you're doing. Just lift your microphone a bit, and that should probably help us to resume interpretation, please.
Sure, thank you. And apologies for that. I had to just transition to be a bit closer to the house because I have a speech in a moment. But I just say that this authoritarian trend, we see that it puts on right-wing clothing, it puts on left-wing clothing, it puts on centrist clothing in certain countries. It justifies itself in terms of, very often ethnic nationalism, but drawing from all different parts of a sort of conventional right-left economic political spectrum. And I mean, I think we know this. I mean, I think we see the authoritarianism of the regime in Venezuela, in Cuba, in China, in Belarus. We see the human rights abuses perpetrated by the governments of Iran and Saudi Arabia. And it seems like an odd enterprise to try to classify as right-wing or left-wing according to our own understanding of those terms, the authoritarian trends and human rights abuses that are taking place in some of these countries. Mr. Chong has, I think, made that point well, and he has alluded to best practices recommended by CSIS. In response to that, Mr. Fonseca said, well, we hear the media use the term right-wing extremism. I don't know if that's really true. I mean, there may be some media who use this terminology. There may be other media who use different terminology. But I think even if what he said is correct, I think we should be more motivated by the best practice coming from CSIS to correctly classify the kinds of extremism that we're talking about. I at the end of the day, I don't have a sense, based on what's been said so far, of what in 3 meetings in particular we would study, of which of a limited possibility of witnesses, of course, in just 3 meetings that we would hear from, what the scope would be. I think you could identify a few specific ideological movements. You could identify a few specific countries or a few specific organizations that you might want to study in the time prescribed. But this is a big catch-all with an ideological buzzer that doesn't fit attached to it. So I would really suggest that, well, first of all, we adopt the amendment, and then we take a little bit of a step back, and maybe we've got a full agenda for the next few meetings, but that we have discussions at the Subcommittee on Agenda and Procedure, and we say, there's some merit to the ideas here. Let's figure out, do we want to look specifically at violent movements that identify with National Socialism? Do we want to look at 2 or 3 particular countries which are moving in an authoritarian direction? Do we want to look at one particular group of victims mentioned in the motion? Do we want to look particularly at persecution against LGBTQ plus people? Do we want to identify some category of violence or state?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
I think those I think that would be a more productive way of focusing our story.
Point of order,
Mr.
Chair.
Genius. Yes, Dr. Fry, point of order.
I'm sorry, we're discussing the amendment. I appreciate Mr. Genius's points about the motion as a whole, but can we stick to the amendment right now and then we can go ahead to the motion as a whole, please?
Thank you, Dr. Fry. Yes,
Sure.
in the interest of time, colleagues, just to remind you, we have a hard stop at 5:30. Mr. Genius, if you could just redirect your comments as precisely to the amendment as possible, that would be helpful.
Sure, thank you. Well, I'll just make one more comment on the amendment, then, and I'll wrap up. I'll wrap up on that for that. But I think the goal of this should be that we be united as a committee in identifying language that we can use that isolates extremists and that condemns extremism. I think, generally speaking, we stay away from, at least I very much try to stay away from, terminology like Islamic extremism, because the implication of that use of language for people from the Muslim community, they have told me, is that they see that as potentially making implications or casting aspersions on all of those who are Muslim. So that's why I think even the media, but certainly parliamentarians, try to be precise in their language to avoid the implication of associations with broader groups. So I think, although not all of the same issues apply, a similar principle applies in that when we are calling out extremism, we shouldn't associate that extremism with another political philosophy or a faith tradition or anything else. That we should try to identify and isolate the extremism itself as being the thing we're condemning, not the group whose name those extremists may be trying to use. So I think that should be taken into consideration by members as well, and I hope this amendment will pass. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Genius. Monsieur Bergeron.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Personally, the motion was fine to me from the start as it was drafted at the beginning. However, I am of the view that we should try to avoid those types of things that could actually lead to divisions among us. And I think these two terms, these two words, are of the nature that they may divide us. So for me, anything that aims to attack the rights of women, LGBTQ+, all of that is extremism. I am perfectly fine with, in fact, I was fine with the motion as it was initially drafted. I would be perfectly fine with the idea that we would just simply refer to extremism. Mr. Genius is absolutely correct in saying that it's in the People's Republic of China that that apparently women would be forced, sterilized by force, and this is not a country that could be qualified as being right wing. And it's quite true that, the term Islamic extremism, or actually the certain groups attack the rights of women and LGBT groups, etc. That's also a form of extremism. Any attack on the rights of women, LGBTQ+, etc., all of this, to my mind, is extremism. So I would be inclined to agree with Mr. Chong's amendment in the sense that I feel we should use the term extremism alone, which would, in fact, avoid politicizing our motion and creating division, and would effectively mean that our motion is a collective motion, that we would all find ourselves reflected in it in a way, because at the end of the day, the purpose of this is to ensure that we can address the issue of extremism that affects the rights of women and LGBTQ+ communities. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm in favor of Mr. Chong's amendment or motion, even if I personally I was personally fine with voting in favor of the original motion. I'm in favor of Mr. Chong's motion.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron.
About 3 minutes remaining. We have a hard stop tonight because of resource constraints. What I propose to do, Dr. Fry has the floor next, is
Sorry,
to let her...
I couldn't hear you, Mr.
I'll repeat.
Chair, because you were moving. It was kind of like floating in and out. I'm sorry. But am I up next? Is that what you were saying?
I'll repeat what I was going to say, Dr. Fry. I said we had about 3 minutes left. I will give you the floor. And then what I propose to do, Dr. Fry, is to preserve the speaking order just like we did last time. And we adjourn at 5:30 and resume the discussion at the very next opportunity in committee business. And you have the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I actually agree with Mr. Chong's amendment. I think if you want to get a good job done on a study, you want to walk away from being subjective or too subjective or use too many adjectives that describe what your ideology is about. I think the word extremism, because when you look at Belarus and you look at Russia and you look at China and you look at Venezuela and you look at non-governmental organizations like Antifa, etc., we have left-wing extremists and we do have right-wing. And I have heard the argument CSIS made, and it's a good argument. So I think let's just kind of like take away this florid language, if we like, and just talk about extremism in whatever form it takes. I am very happy to support the amendment. As a mover of the motion, I'm happy to support Michael's amendment.
Dr. Fry, thank you very much. We are now down to about a minute, and I will give the floor to Ms. Sachs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate Dr. Fry's support of the potential amendment. However, I think it's really important to clarify that how we got here with putting this motion on the floor in the first place, and the temperature and the rise, a particular rise in extremism that we're seeing, just as Mr. Fonseca mentioned, south of the border, that, there's a lot of good work to be done, but we need to be clear on the lenses that we're looking at in identifying and naming each of these categories of extremism. It's very easy to do this broad lens, but there are definitive categories that are in mainstream, both news outlet and also in academic conversations and studies on whether it's religious extremism, xenophobia, and so on and so forth. And so, I don't want us to start to make the umbrella so wide that we lose the purpose of why we're honing in on this at this time. And I think I'm just being mindful we are at the 5:30 mark, that we need to explore this a little bit, that when we put the lens of extremism, that we're not making it too broad for the purpose of the study that we want to do in 3 sessions.
With apologies, let me interrupt you there. We are at 5:30, and tonight we have a hard constraint because of House of Commons resources. I propose that we do exactly what we did last time. On Mr. Chong's amendment, I have yourself, Ms. Sachs, Mr. Oliphant, and Mr. Fonseca as being in line, as well as Dr. Fry. That we preserve that order and reopen our discussion at the very next committee session on Dr. Fry's motion in that order, with colleagues then being invited to add themselves to the list as we continue the discussion. If that's agreeable to the committee, then we will capture it that way, and we will stand adjourned until our next session next week. Thank you so much, colleagues. Be safe. Merci beaucoup.
you.